All right, hello and welcome to Sci-Philipod. This is your host, Benjamin Weingart, assistant professor at Hillsdale College. We got the co-pilot, Bo Weingart, who will introduce himself momentarily. First, we'll just note that this is part of a podcast series that we plan on doing for the foreseeable future, where every Friday or Saturday, depending, we will cover the week's political events and break them down, kind of provide some of our own opinions. And hopefully we can do this for, at least the next few months or so. See if anybody's interested in it.
Also, we'll conclude with an interesting article that we think is maybe germane or just philosophically intriguing.
Yes. So an article of the week every week.
Yes.
So this week, what we plan on doing is we'll cover the impeachment, what's going on with the world of social media, and our article of the week comes from Matt Yglesias on his Substack, Slow Boring, which I highly recommend subscribing to if you have extra money. It's very much worth your while. And his piece is entitled "Small Business is Not the Answer." So we'll be discussing that at the end.
Yeah, we'll provide a link to it when we put this up.
Yeah, so let's start with the impeachment drama that happened this week after the January 6th Capitol riots.
Yes.
So just first, Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives. And
first, we had the Capitol riot, which we did discuss before, but which I think looks worse and worse the more information comes out. I think Jonah Goldberg said it correctly, that this is one of those rare events that actually looks worse in retrospect and worse as more information leaks out slowly and we understand what actually happened, because all of these videos have come out. The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post have put together these videos from TikTok, etc., like what happened, and the amount of violence and rage that was unleashed was much more than I thought. I mean, I know a police officer was bludgeoned to death with a extinguisher, and that's obviously bad, but I didn't realize how bad it was. When you start to watch these, it's really horrifying, and you do realize it could have been a lot worse. So we have that.
And it has come out, it's been reported lately in the last couple of days that there were definite plans among some of the rioters to execute and assassinate political leaders if they came in contact with them.
Right. Yeah.
So yes, this is not a case where people just haphazardly breached this perimeter and started running around. Now, some of the protesters did actually do that. They were surprised that they were able to get into the Capitol building.
Right.
But many of these individuals clearly wanted this to happen and were willing to take it quite far.
Now, one thing to note, maybe for 2 minutes or something before getting into the impeachment thing, is a lot of people on the right, especially the more populist right, and this is something actually that we heard from Boebert and Gates and other representatives, so it's completely germane here, is, well, what about the left and all of the riots across the summer, the BLM riots, and how disgusting was that? And they didn't denounce that. Why is this any worse? Why is the media suddenly wringing its hands and clutching its pearls about all of this? Isn't this just rank hypocrisy? Here, I'll provide my response and you can provide yours. Mine would be, there is some hypocrisy, doubtless, because it is true that mainstream media outlets not only did they not denounce a lot of the protests across the summer, they positively praised them.
Mm-hmm.
And the property damage from the riots over the summer is massive. I was reading articles on it, looking over you're talking billions of dollars, I think, of property damage. I was just looking at Minneapolis and going through all of the property damage. It was incredible. Over 20 people died, etc. So what happened over the summer was grotesque, and we denounced it. Obviously, if anybody follows our Twitters, we were horrified by it. And a lot of people did denounce it, but I would say it's fair to note that the media did not denounce it as forcefully as they're denouncing this, and nor did political leaders. I mean, Biden did issue statements against violence, but really they weren't very focused or forceful, right? They were kind of vague. Violence is never the right answer. They weren't as impressive as they should have been.
To be clear, we're referring to Democratic political leaders.
Yeah,
the Republicans denounced it forcefully and repeatedly.
That's right. But so it's true. Two things. One, the hypocrisy of the left does not justify or somehow exonerate what happened here. And two, I do think there's something different, symbolically at least, about storming the Capitol. It's just a more heinous display. It's more dangerous to democracy, and it was egged on by the literal president of the United States. So I think this is just a more egregious, acute display of rioting.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think the going anti and just focusing your ire on the media, I think is misplaced at this point. I mean, we can criticize the media's role in Black Lives Matter and promoting the Antifa and these protesters across the summer, putting out a highly tendentious, if not outright false narrative of George Floyd and what happened there, and going all the way back to Michael Brown and the emergence of Black Lives Matter. But that doesn't excuse anything that's happened now, nor the fact that not only was it Trump, but also Republican leaders who were throwing fuel onto the conspiracy, the idea that the election was being stolen, right?
Agreed.
And it's not clear if this is the case, but there's some emerging evidence that perhaps some Republican representatives were somehow involved in the riots, at least had some unsavory contact with the rioters themselves.
Yeah, so these kinds of things we would like to know more about.
Yeah,
I hope the Senate trial, if they have it, which I think they will reveal the details here. Like, also, what was Trump doing for the hours as this was happening, right? There are reports that he was delaying sending out the National Guard, et cetera, and that.
Right. And also, let just what we do know. So, like, we can lament the fact that Biden didn't forcefully denounce BLM over the summer. But compare that to Lauren Boebert, the representative, Q-friendly representative from Colorado, who, when the Capitol riots were occurring that day, so that day she tweeted out, "Today is the day American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass." She also noted today is 1776.
Yes.
After the protest, she refused to wear a mask when the House and the Senate, when they had to take cover, and she's clashed with security since then over the security measures they're taking, the metal detectors, saying that she brings a gun into the chamber,
Right. So forgetting the other things about her performative populism or whatever you want to call it, focus on the 1776 and the kicking ass.
Yes.
The 1776 tweet, which was something that a lot of these leaders said or hashtagged or tried to hashtag. Maybe, I don't know if you can hashtag numbers, but that was like a meme that was going around. Seems to encourage violence, because of course 1776 is the American Revolution, and that was obviously violent. So there's at least flirting with the idea that, look, violence would be justified here because your democracy has been stolen from you. And
yeah,
the way
Boebert's explicitly saying that your democracy is getting stolen by
Right.
the Democrats, big tech, mainstream media. And today
Right.
is the day that you kick ass and take names about it.
Right.
I imagine the response if Joe Biden.
Well, to be fair, Joe Biden was the presidential nominee, not a member of the representatives. And there were representatives who said probably equally inflammatory stuff about BLM or on the BLM side. Maxine Waters there's the famous, video of her speech telling people to harass Trump followers or Trump staffers, people.
Oh, yeah, you mean earlier? That wasn't
Earlier. Yeah. So
yes, but
let's focus on Trump because he's the one who got impeached here before we go into the Boebert. But just noting, of course, that yes, there's some hypocrisy. There's almost always hypocrisy in politics, but focusing on the hypocrisy is, to quote Thomas Paine, right? It's pitying the plumage instead of the dying bird, right? It's focusing on the wrong thing. It's like hitting a deer and focusing on the bump in your car instead of the dead deer. It's just a complete distraction from what should matter at this point, in my view. So while this riot was happening, in fact, Democrats were already thinking about going forward with the second impeachment, right?
yes, that is correct.
And there's a lot of debate about what should they put in the articles of impeachment. And we're not going to get too much into the weeds on that. I don't think we want to.
The specific article, there's only one article.
Oh, yeah, the specific article, and exactly
an incitement of insurrection. But just important on the article of impeachment itself, it is not simply the case that Trump was impeached because he specifically incited the crowd outside of the Capitol. It's not just that speech.
Right.
It's also the events preceding the election up to that point. Specifically, the article notes his January 2nd call with Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger.
Right.
So whether or not the riot and breaking into the Capitol was pre-planned is immaterial to the impeachment itself, I think. I don't think it bears on whether Trump should be impeached or not.
Right. So
that's the only thing. I just wanted to note that because I saw some conservatives and anti-woke types saying, well, if it were pre-planned, that changes the entire narrative and makes the impeachment false.
Right. So let's note that, okay, so the impeachment, we get all Democrats in the House vote for it. Yes. 10 Republicans vote for it.
Yes.
So you get,
I'm sure we'll get back into
bipartisan support, although not much, obviously. So then the question,
more than for Clinton, where only 5 Democrats broke and went for impeachment.
That's right. Yeah, and obviously more than the first impeachment, in which 0 members of the House, the only Republican who supported it at all total was Mitt Romney.
That's right.
So what is impeachment? Do we favor it? Is maybe like the best thing to address before addressing the people who voted for it or maybe who voted against it. So impeachment, we're not constitutional scholars, but it's worth noting, like, what's the specific point of impeachment? What's the language? And the language in the Constitution is that president and executive appointees can be impeached for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the language. Now, there's a lot of debate. So treason and bribery seem pretty clear. There's a lot of debate about what exactly does high crimes and misdemeanors mean? What does that constitute? And in fact, there was it said maladministration, and Madison was concerned about that because he thought it was too vague and that it would allow impeachment for almost anything. So instead we get this high crimes and misdemeanors, and we can look at the scholarship on this. It's a complicated issue, as most constitutional issues are, but it is pretty clear that it doesn't mean that you have to have committed an actual imprisonable or somehow actionable crime. You can, if you severely abuse your office, or you abrogate your duty in such an egregious way, you can be impeached. Impeachment is the political solution to this problem. And in fact,
so regardless of whether Trump is legally guilty of incitement,
correct.
And so the conclusion of the article of impeachment notes that Trump gravely endangered the security of the United States and the institutions of government. He threatened the integrity of the democratic system, interfered with the peaceful transition of power, and imperiled a co-equal branch of government. He thereby betrayed his trust as president to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. That's their summary. It seems pretty clear that that is an accurate summary of Trump's behavior post November 3rd.
Right. And then so a lot, you can get into the weeds on what constitutes an impeachable offense. You can look at the history of people who have been impeached all the way back to John Pickering, who was the first person convicted and impeached and convicted in the early 1800s.
The first political figure.
Yeah, he was a judge, and that actually caused partisan squabbling because Democratic Republicans saw it as, or Federalists saw it as a political maneuver, although he was apparently at that point completely mentally decrepit and maybe an alcoholic. So
that brings up one thing about impeachment is that it's unavoidably political.
It is, yes, exactly.
It just is.
It's political, and I mean that's the Gerald Ford saying. It's like an impeachable offense is whatever you can convince Congress is impeachable, right? Now there is a text there, so I don't think it's not that loose, but it is loose. It's inevitably political.
Yes.
Interestingly, though, I don't think you're getting a lot of debate about, is this in principle an impeachable offense or an impeachable series of behaviors from Trump, right? I haven't seen a lot of argument about that.
Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio argues against that and says this is just an attempt to cancel people you don't like to listen to.
Right. So there have been a few of the like fiery performative populists who have said, this was just a political speech, and if we impeached anybody for this kind of behavior, nobody would be here. The Capitol would be empty because everyone would be impeached.
Yeah, no, the myopic focus on the speech itself rather than all of the events following the election.
Thing here is like, look, from the loss in the election, Trump has consistently promoted a crazy conspiracy, not like some sort of judicious, there was voting fraud in these places, maybe like we're going to work carefully to examine it. I'm going to work with Biden. I want the real winner of the election to be the president. That's not what he's done. Instead, he's promoted crazy conspiracy after crazy conspiracy, maintaining that he won the election in a landslide. There's zero evidence for this, of course. So he's created an atmosphere of completely erroneous beliefs that are hostile to democracy. And then the Wednesday, he invited people to go there Wednesday, January 6th.
And importantly, a lot of the people who were there and even inside the Capitol said or report that they felt that they were allowed to do so because they were encouraged and invited by Donald Trump and other leaders of the Republican Party.
Right. So I think it's fair to view this as basically a political assault orchestrated by Trump and his myrmidons against the United States of America. That is the best way to see this. That's just quite frankly what has happened since the election. And that's what the impeachment is about at this point. Is the Capitol riot was the sort of alarming culmination of the multiple weeks of this complete bullshit, and enough is enough. So I fully support impeachment. I think you impeach and you convict. You do this not only to bar Trump ever from having the chance to run in a political race again, perhaps 2024, but also to send a loud and clear message that this we will not tolerate.
Yes.
And to humiliate and defeat Trumpism, to show that this is what happens when you do this. This is you can't just vanquish this. You have to humiliate it. And I know that sounds vindictive, but it's actually not. It's actually, this is like intellectual here. It's, you have to humiliate this so that other people will never try it again, so that it will be seen as an abject failure from here on out. That's my view on it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's, I mean, you have the symbolic function of the impeachment. There's also the very practical. After you vote for conviction, you need 2/3 of the Senate. So 67 senators need to vote to convict. Then you have a separate vote on whether or not Trump can ever run for office again, but you only need a simple majority for that. So it's
which you'll get.
Yeah. So it's certainly the case that if you got the conviction, he would be disqualified for ever running from office.
Right.
And I think it's also important to, because if you get the impeachment, Trump no longer gets the perquisites of being president. He doesn't get the security detail. He doesn't get the traveling funds. He gets none of, his family doesn't get any of those benefits.
Right.
He does not deserve those. They should not receive that.
Yeah.
Right.
Now,
so he should be publicly shamed, humiliated. Yes. It should not be considered part of the tradition of a great American president. Right.
He should be seen as an utter and complete disgrace. And
right.
Lesson,
when they build
the failed lesson to history,
there will be an anti Mount Rushmore.
Yes.
Maybe in North Dakota.
With
he will be on there. James
Buchanan, Jefferson Davis, maybe, and Donald Trump.
Yes,
right.
I would support that.
As a thing before going to the actual vote, the debate on the floor, just quickly, I think it's important to try to do this humiliation and mortification of Trump without, although you can't do this completely. I think it's important to try to separate this from a lot of his followers who were sympathetic to many of the things he stood for, and not to make it appear this vindictive spree where you're just picking off people who already feel very alienated and bitter at the current status quo and the current elites, quote unquote. So however you can manage that, I think you want to try as much as you can. Now, I understand you can't completely separate the two. And if humiliating Trump means you anger some of his base, then so be it.
Yeah, and you're undoubtedly going to, because a lot of people in Trump's base feel personal loyalty to Trump and are not loyal to the larger United States. That's kind of meaningless to them.
Right. Agreed. So we have the impeachment hearing in the House. We have the vote, as we said, 10 Republicans voted for it. All Democrats did. And among the Republicans who didn't vote for it, you had a few kinds of arguments. You could categorize them into different groups. One argument, which I think is the best, like, sort of good faith argument, although I will disagree with it, is the Kevin McCarthy argument, which is what Trump did was reprehensible. It deserves blame, but impeachment would be further traumatizing to our democracy, and therefore it's not worth it. Perhaps what we should do instead is censure Trump. And this is something a number of representatives voiced some variant of this. And I think, again, this is at least reasonable, although it's a bit painful and obnoxious to hear somebody who fulsomely supported the most divisive, like I think quite literally the most divisive POTUS in the modern era, at least post-Civil War, post 1900, let's say, most divisive president in history, in that history, to tell us that what we need to do is unify, and we can't unify by impeaching.
In to Kevin McCarthy's credit, who Kevin McCarthy is the House Minority Leader, he did not whip the votes of his caucus. That is he correct. Allowed people to express their views and didn't pressure them to vote against the impeachment. So I will give him credit for that. And he did think that censure was appropriate. So he at least recognizes that Trump needs to be punished in some way, shape, or form.
I think he was honestly horrified by what happened, but further horrified by the fact that Trump didn't come out and forcefully condemn the violence while it was happening. I think that's what really irked him and depressed him. And I think you see this in, for example, Peter Meyer from Michigan,
who was on the New York Times, the Daily podcast, and noted that was the thing that horrified him the most, was that Trump, his first video was almost expressing support for what was happening.
That's what horrified me the most, by the way, too. I mean, I was already horrified, but when I saw that video, I couldn't believe it. Was just like spitting in the face of democracy. It was unbelievable. So you had that. Then you had let's say it was the more defiant argument, which was, this is a bunch of bullocks hypocrisy. No, I suppose you had the procedural argument. We can't do this fairly. There's no due process. We're going too quickly. So we'll put that aside. That's, whatever. Maybe there's something legitimate to that. I can at least understand that one. But I disagree with it. But the one that irritates me is the bullocks one. This is outrageous. Liberals were literally lighting cities on fire, and now they're lecturing us. How dare they, right? This is the Jim Jordan, Matt Gaetz, Boebert, performative populist, die hard, we're going down with Trump train section of the representatives, right?
Yes. And I am particularly fond of the Boebert. This is, Democrats are just being divisive when your entire political brand is based on sowing discord and division. That's right. What you are all about. It's an existential struggle between light and darkness. Democrats are darkness, we're the light, but they're being divisive.
Right. When the people whose idea of a good tweet is cry more lib, lecture us on how it's so how Democrats are just being divisive and hypocritical. It's irritating, it's vexing. Now it is true, again, as we said before, there is a little bit of hypocrisy, as there always is in politics. Now, what good political figures and leaders do is they allow themselves to adhere to and promote fair principle, even in the face of some annoying hypocrisy, right? Because you're always going to have that.
Yes.
And so I just find this utterly unpersuasive and completely obnoxious. What we should do is focus on Trump's behavior post-election and just ask ourselves, is that impeachable behavior? And I think the answer is unequivocally, yes, it is.
Yes. And the most prominent Republican in the House who voted to impeach was Liz Cheney, who's third in command in the caucus, or third ranking member.
Yeah.
she was quite unequivocal in her denunciation of Trump. And she said explicitly, there has never been a greater betrayal by a president of the United States of his office and his oath to the Constitution. She's facing some blowback for that comment, including
Yes.
among the Freedom Caucus types like Jim Jordan. Ben Dominant in the Federalist wrote a pretty scathing article attacking her, saying she represents the old Republican Party that used to rule, the kind of George W. Bush.
Right. Comparing her unfavorably to Tim Scott, who said he was against impeachment, and saying like that the future of the Republican Party is Tim Scott, not Liz Cheney. I think
Yes.
here you can separate Liz Cheney's foreign policy views, which I
Or even her economic views.
yeah, or economic views with her individual statement in this case, which is what, of course, the Federalist doesn't want to do, because they want to make it an identity issue.
Yes.
Look at these idiot Bush era Republicans, whom many people have negative feelings about. This is their last like desperate gasp against the populist resurgence or ascendancy, right?
I also am fond of it's just this craven move to get attention by Cheney.
Yes.
Liz Cheney is a senator in a state, Wyoming, that went plus 43 for Trump.
Yes.
So I doubt this is a politically popular move in the state of Wyoming.
I guess like I don't care that much about the motivation.
No,
because it's the right thing to do.
That's right.
So
it is just, worth noting that she's not in a state where it was even close. I mean, her state is very Trumpy.
And there was another representative, Tom Rice, who's from South Carolina, which is obviously very Trump, who voted for impeachment and issued a statement attempting to, explain his position, at least basically saying, I voted for Trump. I love Trump, but this is the right thing to do. So I think there were some people who legitimately did what they thought was the right thing, even in the face of countervailing political pressures.
Yes.
I applaud them. I think
now we move to the Senate, and we've been informed that they're not going to bring the Senate back before the inauguration.
Right.
So this impeachment process is going to play out at the same time that Joe Biden's trying to get his cabinet nominees confirmed and pass his early agenda, which will be important because there are signs that the economy is in some trouble. Obviously, we're having trouble with the vaccine rollout, and we're going to need more COVID stimulus. So what do we think is going to happen then? What would be your best prediction of what's going to happen with the impeachment when the Senate reconvenes?
I don't have a good prediction. I would like the trial to move speedily, but I would also like good information about what was happening during the first few hours of this riot. What was Trump doing? What was his attitude? How derelict was he? I mean, it looks bad right now. It might look worse if we get more information about that. But of course, you don't want to take up too much of the time of the Congress with this trial when it is the case that Trump is out of office. So we don't have to worry about him in office. And what this is a sort of resounding alarm to the future. And so like, I think you want to ring that alarm, but I don't know how much time you want to spend on it. So it's a complicated issue.
So if you look at, when the Senate reconvenes, it's going to be 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, with Kamala Harris as the tie-breaking vote. So you have to find 17 Republicans who are going to vote to convict. If you look through the names of Republican senators, it's not easy to find 17 who are going to cross their party. And we already know that figures such as Tim Scott in South Carolina, Roy Blunt in Missouri, Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, probably Rubio. We don't know for sure, but probably Rubio.
Surprised if Rubio voted for impeachment.
Right, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz. These people are.
Rubio
clear knows.
Said we shouldn't do this.
Yeah, I think the argument that most of the senators are going to make, or their basic argument will be, we can't do this fairly, and Trump's no longer president, so what's the point?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. So I mean, McConnell has clearly information leaked that he wanted to leak, which basically said he was kind of happy about impeachment proceeding and thought that Trump's behavior was indeed an impeachable offense. And then he came out with his own statement saying he was open.
Yes.
He was going to pay attention to the evidence, which is pretty remarkable coming from the leader of the Senate. I mean, it's not clear that he would vote for it, but that he even suggested he was open to it.
Yes, I agree. It's quite remarkable. Even if McConnell voted to convict, I doubt that he would be able to bring 16 other Republican senators along with him.
You could probably get Sass, Romney, and maybe, a few others, of course. But I would say this: if McConnell voted to impeach, that's the most important single vote in my view. Like, it might even be, I don't know if it's more important, but like, if you can get McConnell, and let's say you get 60 votes and one of those votes is McConnell, I think that would be a huge and very important rebuke of Trump. Now, we know that McConnell hates Trump. There's no doubt about it that McConnell finds Trump despicable and would like to get rid of him. And McConnell gave a very eloquent, as we said last podcast, speech against voting for the holding up the certification or giving it back to the states or setting up a bipartisan unit to investigate or whatever. So he has done the right thing, and I think I'm really hoping that he does this. I think that's what I'm looking at. That's the thing that I'm the most curious about, and in some ways most hopeful for, but open to that I will be disappointed by McConnell's vote.
Yeah, so the only thing I think that McConnell cares about more than his loathing of Trump is empowering the Republican Party. Like, that's his raison d'etre.
Yes.
So the polling is very relevant here. So we did get some recent Pew polling. If you look at it, among Republicans or those who lean Republican, support for Trump has collapsed quite dramatically. It went from 84% of 6 months ago, roughly, to it's now at 60%.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple of other important numbers: only 17% of Republicans believe that he should be removed from office. 57% of Republicans said that they think he should be the GOP's 2024 nominee. And 64% of Republicans, or people who identify as Republican, said that they supported Trump's recent behavior.
Yes.
Right. So it's still the case that he's by far the most popular figure in the Republican Party, even though he's a little, more divisive than he has been. Republicans still identify mostly positively with Trump.
Yeah. He's still got his power over the Republican Party, clearly. And what you hope, if you're somebody who likes conservatism but very much dislikes Trump, is that power continues to wane as he's relegated to the background of the party and he loses actual political power, right? And that's generally what happens. And I think this has made him look bad. I think his hostage-like videos that come out for 5-minute videos actually look even stupider, and they humiliate him. And like, it gives Lindsey Graham cover to be like, see, Trump did the right thing. But actually it looks bad for his base and for other people, because people like you and me are like, what bullshit, right? Like this, he's not sincere about it at all. It's way too late. And people who are fervid members of his base feel betrayed by it. So I'm hoping that what will happen is Trump's power will just drain out. It'll drain out like blood slowly from the system, and he will just become this complete anemic. He will always have part of his base, of course, but he will become an anemic figure that McConnell can reject without fear of a complete fracturing of the Republican Party.
Yes. And as we noted in the last podcast that we recorded, there is almost inevitably going to be a, if not an outright civil war, then definite conflict between the various factions of the Republican Party in the next 4 years. And it's going to take a while to see who rises and comes out victorious from this internecine battle within the party.
Yes, doubtless. And it was be interesting to see how McConnell tries to navigate this, given that his goal, more than anything, is clearly to hold the Republican coalition together.
Right.
And to really, he cares about things that are unifying to all Republicans, judges, and opposing certain kinds of progressive policies, right?
That's right.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I honestly think McConnell, if I had to guess, I would say he would vote against it, but I can easily see a world in which he votes for it.
I think he votes against it unless evidence emerges in the next few weeks that it is even worse than we thought it was.
Yeah.
Especially if there's evidence that some Republicans had very unsavory, if not illegal, interactions with some of the rioters, because that's a real existential threat to the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And certainly he wants to avoid as you said, his main concern is holding the Republicans together and increasing their power.
Right.
Agreed. So that's the impeachment issue. Then we move to another topic that's sparked a lot of debate over the last week or so, and that is the power of social media, specifically Twitter. I think has been one of the hot buttons because Twitter permanently banned Donald Trump, and also we had the kind of imitation Twitter, which Parler, the kind of, I would say, conservative version of Twitter that prides itself on its lack of moderation,
right,
got Amazon Web Services dropped them, and Google Play and Apple no longer carry the Parler app in their app stores.
Yeah.
So basically, Parler doesn't exist at this point, at least temporarily.
Right. And also, I think there were, 60 to 70,000 Twitter accounts that were purged.
Yeah, I think it's over 70,000 associated with the Q conspiracy.
Right. And so
were purged from Twitter. My following has definitely taken a hit in the last.
Yeah, so is mine. I don't know how much of that is my consistent attacks on Trump and Trumpism, and how much is all of the bots bots and other people who have been purged from Twitter. But
yeah.
So, we talked about Trump a bit last time, Trump's permanent ban, but just in general, this is a very contentious topic that is partisan, because conservatives, especially populist conservatives, right, feel as though social media has way too much power and influence, and that it uses it recklessly, and it discriminates against conservatives, primarily against Trumpy conservatives, right?
Yes.
And that we should be very concerned about this. And this is something that performative populists, as I've taken to calling them, such as Hawley and Ted Cruz, make a living banging on about and haranguing us about, right?
Yeah, so it's unclear how much performative populists actually believe this narrative and how much it's in their own interest to just promote the narrative because it's helpful to their own interests. Right.
Yes, that's true. And
some of it's just cynical.
Some of it especially about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is completely cynical because it's bullshit that these people know better.
Yeah, it's especially cynical to laud the virtues of the free market and private businesses and talk about, the biggest, most important issue is to get big government out of your grill. And then at the same time, when private businesses decide, here's what we're going to do, here's our moderation policy, you start crying about it.
Yeah. So let's just focus on because you can get into the weeds about, most of the Communications Decency Act was actually tossed out by judges, but 230 remains.
Yes.
You can get into the weeds about 230. Should you tweak it? What is it? Whatever. Should you get rid of it? The repeal part is something I think people just say because it sounds cool, but they don't really think about what it means. But just in general, the general philosophical question or political philosophical question, does social media have too much power? Should it be treated more like a public utility than a private business? And are we opposed to their crackdown on Q conspiracism, people who promoted violence or rioting, and especially banning Donald Trump? Last time we said we thought banning Trump was a mistake for a number of reasons. I think I still hold to that, although I admit that it's a complicated issue, and that holds for the whole social media thing in general. It's just a really complicated issue. Yeah. I don't have strong views about it.
Yeah, I don't either. And I think one problem is that it's very difficult for people to even understand what social media is, right? Like, what is, are we, is
well,
it
I guess we can, you mean like, but we can narrow it down and say, okay, like focus on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
Yeah, so I would be,
and then Google for the big tech, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think I would be okay with these social media platforms having much stricter terms of service and regulating the content that is allowed on there in almost a draconian way. I think I'd be okay with that.
Well, let's start there. You think you'd be okay with that?
Because I'm
going to get into that, but let's start by noting this isn't like the free speech absolutist argument here is just like one of those people. It's like the person who yells it's about the principle and fucks up the debate by just yelling principle, because it's not about the principle. We all agree that certain things should be removed from Twitter, for example. I mean, I think almost everybody agrees child pornography should be removed.
Yes.
Most people probably agree that certain kinds of vulgar nudity should be removed, and that we shouldn't treat it as though it's completely, it's not completely in line with First Amendment jurisprudence, right? Because First Amendment jurisprudence would allow things that I think all of us would agree, or many of us would agree, probably shouldn't be on Twitter, right? Do you think that that's a fair statement?
Yes, and I think we also agree that the FBI shouldn't knock down my door and arrest me if I offer an incredibly bad take on Twitter, including making some incendiary comments.
Yeah.
Right. So it's I'm not advocating that the federal government crack down on social media content. I'm saying, I think given the sui generis nature of social media, that it would be appropriate to regulate the content on there in a more draconian, I don't want to even say draconian, but to more carefully curate the content on there. Right.
And then what you would say is the important thing, if you're going to curate more carefully, more assiduously, more vigilantly, the important thing is to be very clear and transparent about your rules, and to apply them consistently regardless of the follower number of the Twitter account, etc. Right?
Yes, 100%. But I would even go further. I think I'm fairly convinced that what these social media platforms have done to political debate and discourse, and actually just the state of our democracy, they're just actually bad.
Well, I agree with that, but I think that's somewhat of a separate issue.
Yeah. So your point is, given that social media exists.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm favorable toward there should be more moderation of content, universal standards. It should be transparent. People sign their terms of
right. You get on
usage.
You sign your usage. You say yes, I'm okay with this. In the same way that, for example, the National Review goes through their comments and deletes ones that are offensive, that say racial slurs or things that they don't want on there. So too, Twitter can go through and say, we don't want these kinds of tweets on here. They make the experience for other users unpleasant, and
they do.
And we're a business and we don't want that. So that's one completely legitimate argument. Now,
I just think human nature is such that we're not used to these virtual environments where people can be anonymous, and they just there's no limit to the ideas and views that they can express, to how rude they can be to other people.
Yes.
That's
true.
And so you look at these kind of nihilistic figures on Twitter, the only thing that's limiting your influence is how much engagement you get. There's no principle of, are you saying something that's intelligent, that's contributing to the public discourse?
But importantly, I don't think curating Twitter more will solve a lot of those problems. So I'm not sure that it's useful to bring that into it, right? Because
I think
you're not going to boot off like a charlatan just for being a charlatan, presumably.
No, but it helps with a few of the issues, right? It helps with a massive abuse that people suffer on social media platforms.
But I think you can separate that from the point you were making. Like, you're going to have people getting popular for spreading bullshit misinformation.
Yes, but they could take a more draconian approach to spreading misinformation as well, right?
Yeah,
should they want to?
They could, but then that runs into problems about what counts as misinformation.
Absolutely, I agree. There are a lot of fraud issues. There's no good solution here,
right? But
there's just not.
Let's make this okay. So let's make the strongest case for what you're saying, and then make this perhaps the strong case against it. So the strong case for more regulation, for more moderation, would be, first of all, it's a private business, right?
Yes.
So we agree in principle that they can do it. And then next, it's the comparison with the sort of public marketplace of speech, the public square or whatever, is a really bad comparison, because
awful, yeah.
Right, because it ignores a lot of features of Twitter or Facebook that are different from the market square. One of those things that's very different is that if you're in the market square and you're voicing bullshit, just crazy shit, or yelling at people and insulting them, you might get your ass kicked.
Yes.
Most people will just think you're an idiot, and you're in a market square with like 5,000 people.
Yeah, that's I think the most salient difference is that at most you're reaching a few thousand people, and probably not even that.
Right. So most of those people will just think you're an idiot and drive by. Whereas on Twitter, you might, most people might think you're an idiot, but a few people out of every 1,000 are like, holy shit, that's awesome.
Right.
And then you get a huge following that you would never get elsewhere. Right.
Correct.
But I also think that the sort of shame and humiliation you would feel behaving this way in person is really important. And that's where the mismatch phenomenon comes in. That is to say, Twitter is mismatched to our evolved psychology.
Right.
We interacted person to person or person to group for all of our evolutionary history, and save for the past I mean, if you say phone, maybe not person to person. So past like 120 or 50 years, of course you had pamphlets so you could write stuff, but that was very different from instantaneous opinions, etc. on Twitter.
Yeah.
So it's this mismatched psychology, and it allows people to act like jackasses and charlatans on Twitter
and cultivate a very devoted following,
right, in a way that you would never do in person.
And furthermore,
right?
then if you look at the kind of public market for speech, the other avenues you had to express yourself, like newspapers, the television, those are highly curated. You can't just write some batshit editorial and get
Right.
carried by thousands of
Yeah,
newspapers.
you can write a pamphlet and try to hand it out to people.
Sure,
and
right.
Maybe 20 people in the market will read it, right?
Right.
But yes.
Yeah, but to have an op-ed that's carried in the newspaper, you actually have to have something reasonably intelligent and useful to contribute to discourse.
Right. So this is the thing that I hate about debate is I hate what you call Mr. Principles, even though I'm sure I resort to this myself, Mr. or Mrs. Principles, to be neutral on sex. They come in and act as though there aren't trade-offs. Like, dude, it's I get this all the time. It's simple, free speech, boom. No, it's not simple, because it is just a fact that the world of discourse in Twitter is pretty dismal. It's pretty repulsive in many ways. And that's what happens. It affects everybody, that you have these charlatans who get their ideas out there, or these just tribal warriors who everything is like the other side is stupid. And their tweets are retweeted hundreds of thousands of times, and it just clouds the marketplace of information, right? So
and then importantly, as people are socialized into Twitter, and they have, you start with this goal: I want to get as many followers as possible, I want as much engagement, retweets, likes, etc. The way you're socialized into that, you quickly pick up all of these terrible habits of be as divisive as possible, tweet some bullshit that you don't really believe once in a while just because you think it'll get engagement, right? It really corrupts the way you engage in public discourse.
It actively creates sort of the worst kind of discourse that you can imagine, because what you want in the world of discourse, especially public discourse, I mean, it's different from having private conversations with your buddies or something. You want disciplined, reasoned, careful, considerate takes. That's what you would like in the public marketplace.
Yes.
We all know that.
And with free speech, you want people to be able to express their carefully thought out opinions on controversial topics without getting suppressed.
Right.
So that is important. I agree with that 100%.
But the problem is the incentive structure of Twitter actually undermines that, because it makes everything divisive, impulsive, actually stupid. The stupider it is, the simpler it is, the more inflammatory it is, the better.
Yes, the more it's amplified. Yes.
If Twitter can work hard somehow to regulate that, that would be a good thing. Yes. And that's sort of the case for more moderation. It would make the marketplace better. It would make discourse better.
It would it would make public discourse and political discourse more salubrious. It would also have a beneficial effect on individual psychology, right? It would save a lot of people from needless suffering, from getting bullied, or every like you tweet something and you get 100 replies that are just fuck off and die.
Right. And so this is another thing where it's different from in-person behavior, because in-person behavior, you refrain from a lot of things because you're you would be ashamed or whatever, whereas on Twitter you don't. But also, if you do fuck up, it's weird because it's not the same feeling, right? It's like in some ways it's worse and more immediate, but it makes more sense because you can deal with it, apologize for it, try to renegotiate your relationships or your standing with the people. Whereas on Twitter, you say something, somebody retweets you who hates you.
Right.
They misread it uncharitably on purpose. And then you have hundreds of people telling you that you're a fucking idiot. You should die. What the fuck? That's stupid. I mean, it just can be very unpleasant, certainly. So that's that. But then the argument against that, of course, would be Twitter is closer to a public utility than it is really to a private business because there's no real competition to it. And in fact, what we saw happen to Parler, where Parler went from healthy alternative to dead in a matter of days, is precisely why we should be worried about Twitter. There's no expectation that Twitter, this incredibly woke company, I mean, not that Jack Dorsey's necessarily very woke, but the workers there are woke. So the company ends up being woke. This woke company, we can't trust them to exercise this kind of power. And in fact, in some ways, it is a civil right to be able to access social media, Facebook and Twitter, because that's where the media talk to themselves. That's where like the important opinions and players are. And to banish somebody from that is a serious punishment. That would be the sort of counter argument.
What happened to Parler is, regardless of what you think of Parler, is deeply disconcerting because, basically a few big tech giants decided to disappear them. And that's what happened. They're gone. They're vanished, right?
Right. I mean, they can find a different web host, right?
It'd be as if I desperately needed a new car, and the big three, and then the Japanese car makers said, too bad, we're not going to sell you one. Fuck off.
No, we have your name and your picture. We're not selling.
Yeah, try to come to a car lot, see what happens. That level of corporate power is disconcerting to me. Right.
Yes. Now,
so
I think agree with that. But then when you start to think about, okay, well, what do you do about so this is the argument for, being more cautious about this with Twitter, being more cautious about giving them power, is that they're more a public utility. We can't trust them to exercise these powers. It should be basically a civil right to get on, etc. I think I'm less sympathetic to those views even than I was a week ago, although again, it's a complicated issue. But let's just take like a concrete one. What about incels? So these are involuntary celibates, and they would get on the internet and find each other in these chat groups. I think they used to do it on Reddit before Reddit cracked down. Now they do it on more obscure groups. But they have this very misogynistic narrative to which they claim fidelity. And in fact, they sort of like build it together. They build this elaborate castle of grievance.
Right.
Importantly, as a community, they do it. It's something they couldn't build or wouldn't build individually, but they do it as a community. And so they're all adding to each other's elaborate grievances about the world, and especially about women. And if you read this stuff, because I got interested in it, so I would go in and read these chat rooms from time to time, it's truly appalling and horrifying, and real violence can be the result. It's clearly can be dangerous. So what do you do about it? Do you go okay, well, if they want to talk about this stuff, you should be allowed to talk about it as long as you're not directly inciting violence? Or do you say, no, like, we don't want an internet that promotes this. This is something that you could never do in the public square, because people would, there's just no way you could have this kind of a get together group in the public square.
Right.
And in fact, we wouldn't let it happen in the sort of proverbial library if you get into the so-called, transvestite, transgender reading hour that people get worked up about. But certainly we wouldn't give these incels an hour in the library to exercise their free speech rights, to talk about how much they hate Stacey's and Chad's and how women are evil and despicable, and they always the virgins are the only thing that are good, wonderful, and they have these all of these weird ideas about what women owe them, etc.
Right. So do we feel good about coercing Twitter to have to allow people with such views on their platform?
And my guess is most people, even the people who make this an issue, the Ben Dominiches, the sort of federalist, Molly Hemingway, big tech is evil, Josh Hawley, for example, I don't think they wanted Twitter like that. I think if they started seeing that kind of material and incels became popular promoting that kind of material, they would be horrified by it.
Yeah, suppose that Twitter became like 80% incels plus Holocaust deniers.
Well,
how would Hawley feel about that?
Sure, but I don't think that's like one of those. Imagine there were no cake bakers in all of Colorado. It's like that changes the problem substantially, don't you think?
It does, but I think what it draws attention to is the fact that there's really a coercive component to this, that you're forcing Twitter to allow this to take place on their platform.
Oh, right. By saying to Twitter, you can't moderate this stuff, or
you can't kick these people off.
Yeah, that is coercive. There's coercion somewhere. Either way, any way you do this, there's coercion, and like people don't like coercion, and it's easy to demagogue coercion because you can always get the people who are aggrieved about being coerced, and they're going to agree with you usually, right?
Right.
Yeah. The question is, what's the best thing for the country, for society, etc. And that's
and again,
difficult.
Dorsey and Zuckerberg, I mean, obviously they're tremendously wealthy and powerful. I don't feel any particular sympathy for them as individuals, but they are in a very difficult spot here, right? Trying to weigh out how to deal with this, right? Like, and you saw Dorsey did a thread on banning Trump from Twitter, where he seemed seriously reflective and disconcerted about feeling as though his hand was forced by Trump. Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think
like it's not like he was twirling his mustache and like, fuck Trump. I love liberals.
Agree with that. I think I think conservatives, especially the more populist conservatives, rightly get concerned because they look at Twitter and they see a very woke workforce that is very hostile to their views.
Yeah. And there are all kinds of double standards on Twitter. Right. 100% agree. But again, what is the best solution to that? Just to allow a free for all?
No, that's clearly not. And I don't think anybody really wants that, which is why I would like the debate to become more about details than principles, because I don't think anybody wants it. And I think I floated this idea, but it was a stupid idea. I don't think anybody wants a Twitter that is just like the First Amendment marketplace, because I don't want people cursing at other people, insulting them in degrading ways related to their race or their sex, etc. I'm fine with getting rid of that. Right. I think most people are fine with not allowing certain kinds of graphic violence, graphic sexuality, etc. on there. Right. So, of course, the question is just, where do we draw these lines? What are we trying to do? I think I agree with you that more curation would actually be better. More moderation, more vigilance. But the problem is it needs to be transparent and fair.
Yes.
That's what needs to happen.
There also has to be something of a shift in social media culture such that you view Twitter and Facebook as privileges that you are granted that come with responsibilities, as your speech and your daily life comes with responsibilities, right? You don't go into your workplace, flip a bunch of people off, tell them to fuck off, and that Democrats eat babies,
I,
right?
I
But
agree with that, and that's something that you
but you can do that with
automatically
your friends, right? I
right.
mean, there are places for engaging in off-color humor, etc. But my
Well,
point is treating social media as this public sphere that requires some inhibition of your worst instincts and some
oh,
responsibility in adult behavior.
I agree with that. And that's where I think it's hard to create this culture and we're just stumbling along in the dark, as it were, because
Right.
this workplace behavior, we all get that it doesn't even feel coercive that I
That's
can't
right.
go into my workplace and tell some really racist joke to everybody. That
Although it does to some dark enlightenment figures.
okay, there
They
are
apparently
right.
are
There
very
are
troubled by
people
that.
who are troubled that you can't say faggot in the lunchroom or something. But
Right.
to me, that's not it doesn't feel coercive or troubling. I understand that you know when you're in a group of people inhibiting certain things that you might like to say. That's what civilization is about, right? I mean,
Yes.
it
Yes.
requires self-control and discipline. Figuring out how to make that how to apply that to social media is the hard thing because you've got these people who their whole shtick is being a Twitter id and just saying like the first thing that comes to mind and mocking the other side viciously, not adding anything intelligent to debate, etc. And they feel as though it's intolerable coercion to
Right.
prevent them from doing that. And
Right.
that's the hard part.
Yeah. And to be clear, we want to encourage people who have heterodox views to offer those in good faith and to
Right.
make sure that we're not kicking people off of these platforms simply because, let's say, somebody had this interesting, well thought out, view of what's happened to the Democratic Party over the last 2 decades or something. I don't want that person to get removed from Twitter simply because their perspective is heterodox or far outside of the
Right.
Overton
I
window.
think we can make a distinction. That's most of the time we can easily discern the difference between forwarding a hypothesis, say about average sex differences,
Right.
and saying something about how women are so weak and dumb they can't handle X, Y, or Z. Right. Like
Right.
one is
Yes.
a legitimate argument, a scientific hypothesis, and one is insulting. I think it should be pretty easy to pick out 99.5% of those cases to divide them into their appropriate categories. But there are, of course, there are obviously dangers to allowing or to promoting more moderation. And that's something we have to deal with. What I think is particularly destructive here, as it is in most cases, is certainty and demagoguery, right? Or
Yes.
are certainty and demagoguery, which you get, especially on this issue, from the populist right, because they see it as an issue uh, with which they can attract a lot of appeal from Trump followers. It's
That's
easy to
right.
demagogue it and just to make forceful and unqualified statements here and to mock big tech.
Yes. Now, on the positive side, it's nice to see both progressives and performative populists agree that concentrated power is something that we should be skeptical and concerned of. That's at least nice to get
Yes, there is
some
an
melding of the
interesting.
minds there.
Yes, there is an interesting the points the arguments that people on the left were making about the danger of concentrated power in the corporate domain are now
Yes.
being taken up by some people on the right.
There's like this analytic distinction between private concentrations of power and public concentrations of power, but empirically it's blurry. Like it's not clear why you should favor one over the other, or give strict scrutiny to public but not private power.
It was never the bright line that some libertarians made it out to be, where it's just easy because you could say government can knock on your door with guns, Walmart can't, period, end of story.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I'm provisionally I'm in this kind of let's curate more mindset, but I'm open to argument. I think it's just we have to have a productive conversation as a society about the best way to move forward here.
Yeah, I would say I'm provisionally in that category. I still think probably the ban of Trump wasn't the right thing. I can understand it, but I think you probably would have been better to lay out very transparent, clear rules and say if he violates this at all again, he's gone, period. And then I'm open to more moderation like that. Again, as long as the rules are laid out very clearly, transparently, there's a way maybe to argue against them or to raise the issue, and it doesn't seem biased, because I don't want this to be an issue of bias. It shouldn't be against.
I agree. I don't think it should depend. Right. It shouldn't depend upon political affiliation. It should just it's a really important issue. I mean, I think for our politics and also for adolescent mental health. I mean,
shit for everybody's
that's right.
And for just like social health and the way we perceive each other.
Yes. So let's end with our article of the week. The great based Matt Yglesias, his post-Vox
Yglesias,
completely unconstrained by the woke confines of Vox News.
Yes.
So he has this Substack article, as I mentioned, small business is not the answer. The kind of impetus to write this was, of course, Josh Hawley, who was trolling Walmart in a tweet. And his tweet reads, as he's responding to Walmart, maybe you'd like to apologize for the pathetic wages you pay your workers as you drive mom and pop stores out of business.
Right. So the first thing is like he was... So Walmart had like objections about his objections to certifying the electoral vote.
Mm-hmm.
He accused them of being condescending to his millions of voters who think there was something wrong with the election. And instead of graciously accepting Walmart's apology, he went on this faux populist rant of accusing Walmart of paying low wages and driving out mod pop shops. So you can see this idea that it sort of captures, and Iglesias points this out, you get support for it from both the left and the right.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that small is better. Small businesses, these shops where Ted, your uncle's friend, owns the hardware place. You know him, you can go there. And Walmart and other chain stores are seen as the villains who come into these communities and put those businesses out and replace them and completely cannibalize them. And interestingly, I think there are at least two sort of emotional impulses that lead to this detestation of big. One is this more economic one, which we can talk about, which is interesting. But there's also this kind of elitist, there's a sort of elitism, a sort of classism about this, right? Which is interesting because Hawley's always posing as a man of the people.
Right.
But in fact, there is this sort of educated superciliousness that leads to a disgust of big chains, right? Well, you
Yes.
shop at Walmart. Like I go to this, I don't know, some like weird shop that you can only go to in this town in California or whatever.
Right.
Or I don't eat at chain restaurants. How,
Right.
how beneath.
How gauche to
Yeah,
eat at like
exactly.
Wendy's, right? And it's
Right.
encapsulated perfectly by the infamous People of Walmart website, where people go shopping in Walmart
Yes.
and just take pictures of grotesque shoppers,
Right.
overweight people who look
Weird
disgusting.
fashion. Yeah.
Yeah, and just
Basically,
let's make fun of these people.
yeah, right. People seen at Walmart, you'll see that. Yeah.
Yes.
So
I
there
think
is
there's
that.
there's another impetus here, that is, if I grew up in this community, like say when we used to, we'd go to Grand Rapids and you go to Schuler Books, or right, or
Right.
the Barnes and Noble. So you have this relationship with this relatively small business. The people there. You feel some nostalgia for it. This
I mean,
big,
those are chains, to be clear, but
they are. But the point is still that
right.
you feel some kind of personal
Yeah. There's a
affinity
wistful
with,
nostalgia here, right?
right.
For this old Norman Rockwell community in
Yeah,
which you went to Uncle, your friend Uncle, your uncle's friend Ted's hardware shop, and everybody knew everybody, and maybe you'd let it. I need a saw. Maybe you'll let the payment go for the week, and I'll come back and pay you or
right.
whatever. Yeah. So yes, you're right. There's this sort of nostalgic component to it. So there are a lot of emotional forces that push one in the direction of loving this small and of making it an issue that you can win political points on, right?
Yes. And interesting that Hawley sent out these performative populist
Well,
tweets,
let's
because
say what's Iglesias, just broadly speaking, Iglesias's point in this Substack article is actually small is not good often. It's not the
yes,
answer. Big
yes,
is actually good often because it pays better. It adheres more to certain kinds of worker standards, environmental standards, etc. And it's important not to confuse big with or small with antitrust policy, right? So
yeah. I
antitrust,
think that's the kind of key distinction that Iglesias makes,
right?
that we need to make a distinction between bigness and competitiveness, right?
Lack of competition.
Yeah. So if you look at a retailer such as Walmart, they're incredibly huge, one of the largest corporations in the United States.
Right.
But it's hard to argue that they don't face a lot of competition.
Right.
Right.
They do, in fact, yes.
But you could also think of examples of a relatively small corporation where, let's say that they I don't know, create like corks for wine bottles, where there's zero competition.
Right.
So antitrust is something that you use to ensure that there's more competition, right? That's the goal, to make sure that we have multiple companies competing, because competition generally helps consumers. It drives prices down, etc. Bigness then is orthogonal to that. That's Iglesias's point.
It's at least somewhat orthogonal.
Yes.
So it's like if Burger King became integrated with Mars or something, or Snickers as a subset of that. I think Mars makes Snickers, but anyway, so if that happened, should that alarm us? The answer is probably not, because there's still plenty of competition, and we're not going to be worried that there's nowhere else we can get fast food or snack food from. Or for example, I mean, restaurants integrate with the soda companies, or they make deals with the soda companies. So it'll be like Wendy's can only serve Pepsi products.
Yes.
That doesn't worry us, because there are plenty of other options and plenty of competition. Whereas, in your example of some sort of niche market, like certain kinds of cork tops, if they integrated with certain kinds of cork screws, and that was the only industry the only business from which you could get those things, maybe we would be more worried about it, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah, Bigness is not, we shouldn't confuse the two. And Bigness,
Right.
other
are
things equal, Bigness comes with a lot of advantages.
Yeah. So Iglesias enumerates a few of the advantages. So big firms just generally tend to be more efficient, right? They have more efficient supply chains. They hire and promote more productive workers because like the small business, like Ted's uncle's hardware place is run by Ted's uncle, who probably promotes his family members and thinks that's more important than just having the most efficient worker.
Correct.
So big firms, they're more efficient. They provide better options for advancement, right? So a Walmart worker actually can climb the hierarchy and become a manager and earn a pretty good living. Obviously, most low-level Walmart workers don't follow that kind of career trajectory, but it's open to you.
Yeah,
right?
you hypothetically you could, in a way that, again, because let's just call it, Ted's hardware store, maybe he wants his cousin to be the manager or whatever, and so if he doesn't care as much about promoting you, you might be a really good worker, but you're just not going to get that promotion there. And in fact, even if you did, the ceiling's pretty low unless you become the owner, and even the owner is not clear how much money you're making. It's just it's a completely for a worker. There are many advantages to working at Walmart relative to the mom and pop grocery store,
right?
And that's one of them. And another one of them is, what are the other?
So mom and pop businesses are exempt from all kinds of onerous regulations, right? So if you look at a lot of like these regulations that, or let's say, just look at worker protections.
Well, calling them onerous is perhaps not the best.
They could be perceived as
regulations
onerous.
That may be beneficial to workers, though.
Yes. So say protecting workers from gender or racial discrimination.
Right.
That's covered only in businesses that have 15 plus employees, right? So these mom and pop businesses are able to operate in an environment where there aren't as many worker protections.
Right. And Walmart, I mean, just from my own personal experience, having worked at multiple grocery stores, including Walmart far and away was the best place to work, because they clearly were worried about these things and cared about them, because they have scrutiny. And so they were careful to make a pretty good environment for worker. Now, I'm not saying it's something you would want to live on the salary, maybe, and we can talk about that. But in terms of the actual working experience, it was much better than the other places, especially the smaller places, precisely because of that.
Yeah. And then a couple other points here. So one, the big businesses tend to be much more innovative because they have more money for research and development.
Mm-hmm.
Also, importantly, big businesses root out small inefficiencies that smaller businesses don't. So Iglesias makes the point that UPS invested a lot of money in looking at how to like most efficiently deliver their packages, and they discovered that you should avoid left turns as a UPS driver at all costs. Yes. Now, that's something that a small business just doesn't have the resources to do. It's expensive to do. You need to operate at scale for that kind of efficiency to matter to your company.
Right. And I wish I could, it was, of the books on Walmart that I've looked at, there was one that was the most even-handed. And it went over both the pluses and the minuses. And one thing it went over is how much efficiency Walmart puts into the sort of grocery store environment, or I mean, just big box store or whatever, and how much that matters. So like, it used to be that deodorants were shipped, I think they were in like this kind of cardboard, and Walmart realized like that cost, I don't know, like 0.5 cents per unit or whatever. And they were just like, let's get rid of this.
Mhm.
And because they have a lot of power buying from these distributors, when they say we want to get rid of this is inefficient, we will actually make like money in the long run, make it happen. It happens. And that's actually environmentally friendly because it's just less wasteful. Also,
Right.
it's better for the customer because it lowers the prices ever so much. And importantly, if you're a very small local mom and pop shop and you're getting the deodorants and the cardboard like that, it doesn't matter to you if you save 0.1 cents per unit because you're not selling enough units for that to really matter. And furthermore, you don't have the negotiating power to tell your distributor, I'm not going to, if you say, I'm not buying it, if it's like that, your distributor will say, who cares?
Right.
We're
right.
not going to invest in getting rid of this.
Yeah, right. It's not a big deal to a distributor if they lose 50 units like every month. It is a big deal if they lose 5 million units every month,
Right. So
right?
Walmart and these other places have negotiating powers that allow them to introduce cost saving innovations.
Yes. So then, as Iglesias notes, if you look at the most egalitarian social democracies in the world, they tend to have a lot of successful large businesses. The key to having this kind of egalitarian social system is not small businesses, rather, it's to have sectoral bargaining. That is, that you have unions in these different sectors that act as a countervailing pressure to these large business interests. And you have progressive taxes that pay for progressive policies and redistribution, like
Right.
free college, et cetera.
Right. So this is where the hypocrisy, I think, of Hawley becomes manifest and why it's fair to call him a performative populist because he makes these pronouncements on Twitter and mocks Walmart for paying low prices, which empirically they pay better than mom and pop shops. So I don't know
Yes.
what exactly he's talking about there, but then does nothing. He's a senator. Like if you really wanted to address the problem of low wages, you wouldn't spend your time tweeting about it. And in fact, you wouldn't do something that would alienate the very people you have to work with or try to work with to pass policies that would help, right? I think it's understandable if an average person who doesn't have a political position gets angry and says, fuck Walmart for paying too little. Fine, okay? If you're a senator, though, and you want to do something about this, if you want to pass, as I said, effective policy, you don't want to do that. You don't want to make these divisive statements in public that are good at whipping up your base, but really bad for bringing people together to the table to pass policies that you need to pass, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's what's irritating about
Yes.
the sort of Hawley playbook is it's this very publicly divisive behavior that actually undermines his own stated goals.
Yes. Now, Iglesias ends the article by doing a little political economy on Hawley that I found quite interesting. So, Iglesias notes, so if you look at a lot of these performative populists, they tend to be from exurban rural areas,
Right.
districts, or states, as Hawley is in Missouri. The largest businesses in these areas tend to be, locally owned, right? Like doctors, dentists, a car dealership, a construction company.
Right.
These are much more difficult to turn into these hegemonic large corporations.
Yes.
Therefore, these local elites tend to be favorable toward the kind of pandering that Hawley is engaging in, right? Like
Right.
if you're a local car dealership, you really like
Yeah,
some
that's appealing to you,
right.
right?
It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, like uh, I'm the the beneficiary of my community. I'm a great guy. I don't really like Walmart, right? I don't like that kind of bigness. I just
So,
like owning my local car dealership.
right. So in some ways, this is it's an ideology that actually promotes a sort of guild mentality in
Mhm.
which these industries or businesses that for which it is more difficult to integrate and make more efficient corporations or whatever you would say, you're providing cover for that, and you're actually articulating this vision of the world in which that's better for everybody. And what's worse is having these in reality more efficient big corporations that do a better job of it while wasting fewer resources.
Right. So you're specifically promoting restrictions on competition that help the elite in your district or your state, right? You're propping up the elites in your area.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the intuition that, or not the intuition, the principle, the point that the libertarians whom I most respect make about these kinds of guild policies and guild narratives, right? About small being so great. And just because what it actually does is it keeps out competition, and it makes it less efficient and therefore more expensive.
Right.
And what you really should look at are these things like efficiency, what does it actually do to the workers, etc. Those are what you should care about. It's easy to demagogue about Walmart. It's a favorite whipping boy of many people, but it's harder to propose a realistic alternative that would do a better job.
Right. And it's safe to say that the policies that would help those who are relatively poor in the state of Missouri, at least many of them, wholly opposes.
Yes.
Right. Medicaid expansion, some form of universal health care, redistributionist.
Even pro-union, right? Because claims that in the abstract unions are good, but actually they're just so corrupt that they actually hurt workers. Now, here's I guess a question is, well, if they hurt, I mean, that's an empirical question. I would like Hawley to forward the evidence that actually unions hurt workers. I don't think the evidence is very overwhelming for that position. So yes, I think Yglesias is correct to find Hawley abhorrent and to dislike his faux populism, or what we'll call as performative populism. And he calls it out in a humorous way. And this article is one, and it's a problem going forward, I think, because there's this certain section of the populist right who have figured out that populism sells pretty well to voters, but it's really good if you can sell the populism to voters, but still appeal to your donor class, right?
Yes.
And actually not do anything to promote the very things you say you're in favor of: higher wages, better, I mean, what else would you want? Why wouldn't it seems as though if you're actually like more sympathetic to the working class, you would want more generous redistribution. You would probably want to raise minimum wage, although that's debatable. We can debate that. But you would certainly be looking at a lot of these kinds of policies, higher tax rates for the wealthiest certain percent of Americans, et cetera, that many of the people on the populist right aren't promoting, in fact, are actively against.
Yeah, I mean, it's much easier to flog some big tech company that's headquartered in Cupertino, California.
Right.
I mean, it makes for good politics. And that's the thing that's so frustrating about Hawley, right? Is that while claiming to care so much about the working class and the average people, his politics are like so cynically created not to actually attack concentrated forms of power that benefit him, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And it's very obnoxious. And when you think about these issues, like say the minimum wage, I don't have a dogmatic view on that because it's an empirical issue. What does best help the working class? How can you have a dogmatic perspective on that? You'd have to think about it very carefully. Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are trade-offs too, because I I think anybody who's looking at it even-handedly would say there are some benefits to higher minimum wages, including you actually encourage increased efficiency because it makes labor more expensive.
Yeah, and
So
also
yeah.
one huge benefit, Iglesias doesn't go into details on this, but one huge benefit of having extremely large, efficient corporations is that it allows workers to form unions and extract some of the profit for themselves,
Right.
right? And so if you have these really efficient businesses, they do have that excess profit. You can extract some of that. That can go to higher wages, benefits, et cetera. If you have small businesses, there's nothing to take from them, right? Like the
Right.
mom
I
and
mean,
pop place
they
just
really
does.
are hanging on, right? And in
Yes,
fact, when you look at the empirical literature on smaller businesses, many of them are run by people who are doing it for other reasons than money. They're not making their
right.
primary living off of it, or they already have a lot of money and they do it because it's satisfying, which is perfectly fine, by the
Yeah,
way.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's nice to have areas, communities, downtowns, whatever, that have this variegated, that are variegated by small businesses and that aren't completely homogenous or whatever. And that's something people will vote for with their feet. They'll go to those places and they'll pay more money to frequent those stores or outlets or whatever because they like that. But yeah, I've always found this attitude perplexing, and I've argued with progressives about this because they get really angry at Walmart or whatever. And I'm like, if you care about the environment, all of the things you claim to care about are
Mhm.
actually improved by Walmart. It's
Right.
much more environmentally friendly than having a bunch of mod pops doing it, precisely because it's more efficient.
Yes.
It's bigger, and that means you have less waste because you have to get shipments in there. You have huge supply chains. All of that leads to efficiency, which is good for the environment and generally good for the consumer.
Right. And again, as we noted, these small businesses, they don't have the same worker protections precisely because they don't make enough money to afford those protections, right? That's why they're exempted from them. So the huge benefit of Amazon, they're so efficient and operate at such economies of scale that they pay $15 an hour for their warehouse workers. They can support these programs where a worker can go to college while they're working at Amazon,
Right.
right? There are a lot of benefits, protections, et cetera, that I mean, I'm not arguing that Amazon pays as well as they should. That's a separate
Right.
debate, but they certainly pay better and provide more benefits and protections than the local bookstore that Jim runs.
I think, yes. I think what we end up seeing here is a lot of people singing the praises of small business, small communities, Norman Rockwell America, and distracting themselves and other people, their voters, from the actual political policies that we need to enact to deal with the post-industrial economy we're in. Because it's you can talk about all of this stuff. You can wax poetic about the importance of communities and small businesses and people finding meaning in their church, etc. But that's not going to change anything. It's easy to denigrate Walmart or to denigrate Bigness or whatever. But if you're not actually making policies that are going to help and they're going to help promote these communities, and instead of ripping on Walmart, you increase minimum wage or do whatever it is that you would do, or you make a hard decision about increasing tax rates and having a more generous welfare system, you're not going to solve these problems.
Yes, and just as a news flash to Holly, at some point you're really going to have to think carefully, break some Republican orthodoxy, and you're going to have to challenge the donor class. It's going to, if you really care about working class policies, that's inevitable, right? It's just that
Right,
at
because
some point that has to happen, right? Because in order to have an economy that's more favorable to the working class, you are going to have to challenge elite economic interests.
yeah, I'm not a Marxist, but it is
No,
true that obviously capital and labor have competing interests. And so you're
yes,
not you can't be the man whom capital loves while also being the man of the Labor Party. It can't happen. You are going to have to make some hard decisions that will irritate and vex people who are, big business, certain kinds of big business, but like your prominent donors, you'll have to anger them, or the wealthy in general. I mean, I think that there's this, you see this in a smaller way, although here I think it's a much more sincere variant in like a Ben Sass, who talks a good game about communities and the need for meaning and the way that business gives people a sense of meaning, something to wake up for, something they feel that they're in control of, so more autonomy and that kind of creative freedom. I think that's all right, and there's something to that. But at some point, what I want to see coming from that perspective, from that view, is an actual series of policy proposals that would lead to it. Poetry's not going to do it, right? I mean, you can't just, people aren't going to do this via eloquent speeches.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that most maybe this would extend to all politicians that I'm aware of, and maybe it would extend to economists as well. Like we actually just don't know how to address some of these issues associated with post-industrial societies, such as, the automation, the decline of jobs for relatively uneducated people, the geographical segregation between urban and it's tough, but what you really hate to see is somebody demagoguing it just to score political points.
Right, but this is just to be, what we can end this way by bringing it full circle and noting this is kind of what happens to, and I don't think, by the way, I don't think Ben Sass falls in this category. I think he's a decent person who's attempting to grapple with this, but with Hawley and Cruz, for example, and some of these other people, it's the Twitterification of politics, because it allows you to spend your time making these divisive but base-pleasing points instead of working on the real political problems and promoting the policies and principles that might lead to a better America, better post-industrial America, right?
Yeah, agreed. And actually, a lot of these populist types on the right have quite a bit in common, at least in their economic concerns, with even AOC, for example. There could at least be some productive, bipartisan dialogue. And, I mean, I will say I thought it was good that Hawley supported the $2,000 stimulus checks.
So that was one thing where you did get a support of a real policy.
Right. But instead of just, demagoguing the Green New Deal, work with people on it to make it more of a rural, exurban stimulus.
This is the great challenge that you see in the Twitter era, right? And you see this when you read about Bober, who's sort of repulsively fascinating, and this style of, upping the divisiveness is the point. The spectacle is the point. And so these people aren't getting into politics to work hard, to promote policies, to work with the other side, to pass bills. That's not what they're there for. They're there to be a spectacle and to increase their own brand name. Yes. And social media allows them to do that. In fact, it encourages that. And that's I think, the sinister thing about social media is what it does to political incentives, and that it discourages exactly the hard, thankless behavior that you need to encourage to make better policies.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then just from the individual voter's perspective, it's pernicious in that you get this kind of rush of strong emotion and enthusiasm when you see, let's say, Bober make one of these divisive attacks, and it takes your attention away from harder to solve longer term issues in your community, right? And I understand it completely. Like, yeah, like fucking tell that stupid woke lib what's up, right? Like you're
Right.
going to get a frisson of excitement from that.
Yes.
But it doesn't, it really, but
yeah.
but it
Yes.
doesn't, it's not replacing the businesses that have been lost in your community, right?
Yes, you will get a paroxysm of pleasure from the but yes, I mean importantly, compare the immediate pleasure of Boebert telling Beta O'Rourke, fuck you, I'm keeping my guns, motherfucker,
Right.
with Boebert works on this really complicated bill that she manages to get through on narrow bipartisan grounds because they offered a few special like handouts to some Democrats, right?
Right.
Like it's
And
clear.
and this really complex bipartisan bill adds on average $100 to the pocket of her constituents each year, right?
Or it like increases GDP by 0.01% a year.
Right. So it's barely noticeable, but
Right.
it's actually salubrious.
Right.
But yes, it's there's no contest. So the incentives are definitely, especially with social media, set up to favor flame throwing, divisiveness, and negative polarization.
Right. And the sort of, and I mean, the depressing thought here is I don't see why this isn't going to get worse. I mean, these incentives have been opened up for what, the last 10, 20-ish years. I mean, really social media, like 10 years. So you figure it takes a while for all of the younger people to figure out what works.
Right.
And so you had the older generation with, you know, like the sort of first, I mean, you had this first sort of revolution, but then you had the Tea Party revolution and you had like the Ted Cruz types. And now you're getting where like Ted Cruz probably is even like, who the fuck is this Boebert? Like, what the hell?
Yeah. So you get, once you're to the Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert generation.
Right.
And yes, expect more of these individuals to be in the, get elected to House seats. A little bit more difficult to be that batshit crazy and win a Senate race, but it could happen. Ted Cruz won, obviously.
Manages to do it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. All right, so that's a wrap. We'll be back next week to go over the political news. And if anybody has any suggested articles of the week, I'm more than happy to take people's suggestions or advice on those articles.